They thought she was just another quiet girl. Until she stood up bruised, bleeding, and deadly calm. What happened next made the entire school freeze in silence. They laughed as she fell, the sound of her body thudding down the stairs echoing through the corridor like a war drum, and while most students turned away, afraid to be next, nobody knew that beneath the silence and shy glances of that new girl named Aisha was a storm forged in military bases, obstacle courses, and simulated combat. Because Aisha wasn't just another transfer student. She was the daughter of a decorated special forces trainer, homeschooled for years across shifting military camps, trained in self-defense since she could walk, fluent in survival instincts that would make grown soldiers pause. But when she joined Westbrook High, she wanted to blend in, not stand out, to bury the parts of her identity that had seen things no high school drama could ever compare to. But fate doesn't care about our intentions, and neither did Kira, Tanya, and Lexi, the popular trio known for their cruel streak masked behind perfect hair, fake smiles, and loyal followers. So when Aisha accidentally bumped into Tanya in the cafeteria, spilling her smoothie, it wasn't just a mistake, it was a declaration of war, and they made sure she felt it in whispers, pranks, stolen books, tripped legs, and finally that brutal shove on the stairs between third and fourth period, where her elbow cracked against the concrete, her lips split, and the world spun. Yet as she rose with blood on her chin and silence in her eyes, something in her snapped, not the way victims snap, but the way warriors lock into battle mode. Her breath slowed, her eyes scanned exits, angles, opponents, and when Lexi tried to grab her arm with a mocking smirk, Aisha twisted, locked the wrist, and brought her down in one motion so fast that the phone's recording couldn't keep up. And the silence that followed was broken only by Lexi's gasp as her face met the cold tile. Then came Tanya charging in rage, but Aisha sidestepped, hooked a foot behind her, and Tanya crashed into a locker with a hollow clang, while Kira backed off, her voice trembling as she called for a teacher. But by then a circle had formed, students no longer laughing but filming, watching, and whispering. And when Principal Graves arrived, he found not a fight but a girl sitting calmly on the stairs, flanked by two groaning bullies, while security hesitated, unsure whether to restrain the calm one or check the others for injuries. And when the truth spilled out about the months of bullying, the unprovoked shove, the silent suffering suspensions were handed out, but none to Aisha, whose father showed up not with rage, but a quiet nod of understanding. Because he had taught her restraint as much as reaction, discipline as much as defense, and that night, the videos went viral. Military girl drops bullies in seconds. Don't mess with quiet girls. And suddenly Aisha wasn't invisible anymore. She was a symbol, a quiet fury that struck a nerve with students around the world. And though she never bragged, never smiled at the fame, something had changed. At Westbrook, hallways grew quieter. Bullies thought twice. Teachers paid closer attention. And Aisha, who only ever wanted peace, finally found it not by hiding her strength, but by owning it. Walking with scars, silence, and a stare that reminded everyone that behind the shyest girl might live the fiercest storm. And though the trio returned weeks later, quiet, resentful, and forgotten by the student body that now admired the one they tried to destroy, they never dared look her in the eye again, because deep down they remembered that day. The stare, the speed, the precision, and the truth that they hadn't just pushed a girl, they had awakened a soldier. And in a world where cruelty hides behind popularity, it only takes one Aisha to remind everyone, strength doesn't always shout at watches, waits, and when necessary, strikes with unshakable silence. Following Monday, whispers chased Aisha through every hallway like shadows trying to keep up with the sun, students parting for her, not out of fear, but a strange mix of awe and respect. And though she kept her eyes low, backpack firm against her shoulders, her presence now carried weight, no longer the invisible new girl, but the one who'd turned predators into punchlines in a matter of seconds. Yet the attention brought more than admiration. It invited curiosity, jealousy, and something darker from corners she hadn't anticipated. Because while Kira, Tanya, and Lexi nursed bruised egos and lingering soreness, their older brothers Ty, Chase, and Logan, college dropouts with too much testosterone and too few consequences, took offense on their sister's behalf, seeing Aisha not as a survivor but a challenge, another girl to be taught a lesson in control. And so one afternoon, as the bell rang and the school emptied into golden light, Aisha noticed a black pickup tailing her route home, slow, deliberate, and when it pulled ahead to block her path near the abandoned rec center, 3 figures stepped out tall, smirking, overconfident, one cracking his knuckles while another spun a baseball bat, slowly like he thought he was in a movie. And the third called out, "Heard you're good with your hands. Show us," laughing as if this was just a joke, just a warning. But Aisha's heart didn't race, it slowed, like it always did before a storm, her body calculating exit points, potential threats, and the weight of the situation. But she also knew this wasn't the battlefield her father had trained her for. This was the real world, where every move came with consequences that didn't reset after drills. And so she tried words first, calm and clear, telling them to walk away, that she didn't want trouble. But trouble smiled back with crooked teeth and a raised bat, and when Logan lunged, swinging low, she dodged sideways, grabbed his wrist mid-swing, twisted it behind his back, and brought him to the ground in a single move that made Ty freeze in mid-step. Then Chase charged with a grunt, his reach longer, strength higher. But strength is nothing without balance, and she ducked, swept his legs from under him, and in a heartbeat, 2 were down, one nursing a dislocated wrist, the other groaning from a knocked-out breath, leaving Ty standing still, eyes darting, pride shaking. And just as he stepped back, headlights flooded the scene. Principal Graves' sedan screeched to a halt, followed by a police cruiser summoned by a concerned student who had seen the pickup. And Aisha vanished off route, and within minutes the brothers were cuffed, shouting about setups and lies, while Aisha stood silent, calm, breathing slow, and once again, security footage backed her up, grainy but clear enough to show who stalked whom, who struck first. And by the next day, the school was abuzz again. But this time it wasn't just students watching her, it was teachers nodding quietly, counselors rethinking their approach to school safety, and a military recruitment officer who showed up 1 week later, requesting a conversation that Aisha respectfully declined, because she wasn't ready to join yet. She wanted to finish school like a normal girl, whatever that meant. But her story spread further, beyond TikTok and Instagram clips, onto news sites and talk shows where headlines screamed, "High school girl trained like a soldier fights off attackers again." And while the fame didn't sit easy with her, she couldn't ignore the messages flooding her inbox. Girls from other schools, from other cities, whispering their own struggles, thanking her for standing up, for surviving, for fighting back when the world told them to shrink. And though Aisha never replied to most, she read every word, each one a reminder that maybe her pain had purpose, that maybe strength shared silently was still strength multiplied. And back at Westbrook, things began to change, not overnight, but gradually. Stricter rules on bullying, more open dialogues in class, self-defense workshops funded by the PTA, and a quiet understanding among students that some battles are better avoided, especially when your target is carrying not just bruises but battlefield instincts. And as weeks passed, Tanya, Lexi, and Kira faded into the background, their reputations burned by the very fire they tried to ignite, while Aisha, still quiet, still alone during lunch, became something more than a story. She became a signal, a warning, a hope. And though she never boasted or bragged, her presence alone made people pause, made them think twice before laughing at the quiet ones. And deep down, even she began to realize that strength wasn't about hurting others, but about knowing when not to, about walking through hallways full of memories and never letting them own you, about turning pain into a shield and walking forward, always forward, even when the world keeps throwing battles your way, and yet, even as the days grew quieter and the threats faded into murmurs, Aisha remained vigilant, not out of fear but principle. Because she knew peace was never permanent, it had to be protected, maintained, earned each day with choices, restraint, and unshakable resolve. And while others began to forget the girl who rose from the stairs with blood on her face and steel in her spine, Aisha remembered everything: the fear, the silence, the fire she had to hold back, and it made her stronger, not just in body but in soul, a quiet warrior walking among them, unseen but never unprepared. Months had passed since the incident that transformed Aisha from an invisible student into a name that carried weight in every hallway. But while the whispers and viral clips began to fade for most, for Aisha, everything still echoed. The crunch of her elbow on the stairs, the crack of knuckles echoing off cement, the thud of bodies hitting lockers. And though she walked with her usual calm, every step was measured, every look scanned for threat, because surviving didn't mean forgetting. And healing wasn't just about bandages and time, it was about relearning how to exist without expecting attack at every corner, yet peace rarely lasts in places where envy brews. And this time the danger came not in fists, but in manipulation, because the administration, proud of the positive media coverage and newfound discipline culture, began using Aisha's name in brochures, meetings, and PR campaigns. "We support our students," they said, showcasing her story as proof of change, yet never asking her permission, never offering compensation, never acknowledging the trauma behind the headlines, and worse, they began expecting her to represent something: strength, resilience, inspiration, without ever checking if she had the energy to carry those expectations. And soon, teachers called her out in class for opinions on violence. Counselors asked her to lead assemblies on self-defense, and clubs she'd never joined wanted her as their poster girl, until it all became too much, too fast. And one day in chemistry, when a substitute casually said, "You're the one who broke that guy's arm, right?" loud enough for everyone to turn and stare, something inside her cracked, not into rage, but into exhaustion, because she hadn't asked for any of this, hadn't wanted her pain to become a school trophy or a motivational quote. And so that afternoon, instead of going home, she wandered off route, finding herself near the abandoned military training field her father once used for exercise, now overgrown and forgotten, but familiar in its silence. And as she sat atop a rusted climbing frame, wind tangling her hair, she let herself feel the weight she'd been carrying for months, not just of the fights but of the stares, the expectations, the fear that her silence would always be mistaken for strength, when really sometimes it was just survival. And in that moment, she made a decision not to run from her past, but to control how it was used, how her story was told. And so the next day, she walked into Principal Graves' office, calm and clear, and told him she wouldn't be participating in any assemblies, wouldn't be anyone's mascot, and that if her name was to be used, it would be on her terms, in her words, and to his credit. He listened, at least partially offering her the opportunity to speak at the year-end student panel in her own way, a compromise she accepted only because it meant reclaiming the narrative. And when the day came, she stood on stage not in uniform, not in any costume of strength, but in a plain black hoodie and jeans, gripping the mic with both hands as her voice echoed across the auditorium, telling them not the viral version of the story, but the truth: that she didn't want to be a hero, that defending herself wasn't the victory, it was survival, that being strong didn't mean she never cried, never broke, never woke up shaking. And the room went still. Students who once laughed at memes now frozen in a silence heavier than any applause, because for the first time, they weren't watching a fighter, they were hearing the survivor, raw and real. And as she stepped off stage, a girl from the freshman class ran up to hug her, whispering, "Thank you," eyes full of something Aisha recognized: not pity, not fame, but understanding. And in that moment, she realized that maybe her story could matter, Not as a weapon, not as a shield, but as a voice, a permission slip for others to stop hiding their own battles. And so she started something new, not a club, not a movement, just an open circle that met in the library every Thursday. No cameras, no titles, just space, where anyone who had ever felt pushed, silenced, broken, could talk or just listen. And it grew slowly, naturally, until it became the one place in school where honesty lived without judgment. And through that, Aisha found something she hadn't expected: peace not through silence, but through connection. And even though threats still came sometimes, whispers from new bullies who hadn't learned yet, she didn't flinch, because she wasn't alone anymore. And when one day she found a note in her locker saying, "Next time we push harder," she didn't panic. She handed it to administration, then sat down with her circle and said, "Let's talk about fear, because the best way to fight shadows is to shine light." And while Aisha never claimed to be fearless, she had learned how to walk through fear with others beside her. No longer a lone soldier, but a quiet leader, reshaping the very system that once tried to erase her, not through violence, not through fame, but through truth. And that truth echoed long after graduation, in younger students who remembered her, not for the fight, but for the space she created, for the courage she modeled, and for the way she turned pain into something that healed not just herself, but everyone brave enough to listen. By the time senior year rolled around, the legend of Aisha had shifted from whispered awe to something far deeper, a legacy quietly etched into the rhythm of Westbrook High's hallways, not through trophies or titles, but through the subtle changes that now shaped the school culture: students stepping in instead of standing by, teachers listening instead of lecturing, and a newfound respect for silence that didn't equate it with weakness, but with choice, strength, and presence. Yet for Aisha, the most profound transformation wasn't the school's perception of her, but her own evolving understanding of who she was becoming beyond the moments that once defined her. Because as much as the fights, the stares, the threats, and the circle had shaped her story, she knew now that identity wasn't built solely in battle, but in how one chose to live afterward. And so she began to focus on the things that made her feel human again: volunteering at the local shelter, sketching late at night while the world slept, helping underclassmen with assignments, mentoring quietly without ever calling it mentorship. And while she kept a low profile, her presence was undeniable, a kind of quiet gravity that others leaned into without fully realizing why. But even then, peace wasn't without its challenges, because healing doesn't move in a straight line. And one late winter afternoon, while walking past the gym during a basketball game, she caught a glimpse of Tanya and Lexi sitting in the stands, back from suspension and blending in as if nothing had happened, their laughter echoing just like it used to. And for a brief, shuddering moment, the air around Aisha tightened, her breath caught, and memories surged: the feel of the cold stare edge against her ribs, the laughter as she bled, the months of stares. But then, just as quickly, the present returned, clearer than ever, and she realized they no longer held power over her, because her worth no longer came from fighting shadows, but from the life she had built beyond them. So she turned away and walked to the library, where her Thursday circle now filled 3 tables, with freshmen, sophomores, even seniors coming not because they needed saving, but because they wanted to be part of something honest. And that day, she spoke not about fear or pain, but about freedom: the freedom to forgive, to let go, to reclaim time from trauma and give it back to joy. And her words, though soft, resonated more than any viral clip ever had, because they came from lived truth, not spectacle. And even as college applications loomed and counselors begged her to write about the incident to stand out, she refused, choosing instead to write about rebuilding, about the day she taught her little cousin how to defend herself without ever lifting a hand, about the elderly woman at the shelter who said Aisha's calm made her feel safe for the first time in months, about the art piece she painted of a staircase leading into light, titled Ascent. And when acceptance letters arrived, she chose a small liberal arts college upstate, away from the noise, the press, the past, because she wanted to grow without being watched, to learn who she could be when survival wasn't the focus. And on her last day at Westbrook, she walked the halls not as a girl who had fought back, but as a girl who had moved forward, who had turned moments of pain into movements of peace. And when she passed the stairwell, now newly carpeted and labeled with an engraved plaque that reads "Stand Tall, Walk Proud," she paused only for a second, then smiled. Not because the school had honored her, but because it no longer haunted her. And at graduation, when her name was called and applause erupted, not wild, but warm, steady, genuine, she looked out over the crowd and saw not enemies, not fans, but people, many of whom she had helped in ways they might never fully articulate. And as she stepped off the stage, diploma in hand, a younger girl from the library circle reached out and pressed a folded note into her palm before vanishing into the crowd. And later, in the quiet of her room, Aisha opened it to find just one sentence scrawled in neat handwriting: "Because of you, I stayed." And tears slipped down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from the deep, soul-shaking realization that her story had done more than survive. It had saved, echoed, multiplied in silent, invisible ways. And as she packed for college that summer, leaving behind the town that had once tried to break her, she didn't carry fear or bitterness, but a quiet promise to keep walking, to keep listening, and to never